Thank you for joining us again. This is session 2 of our virtual education day for families, coming to you from the University of Chicago Celiac Center. My name is Peggy Hasenauer, and I am honored and privileged to be the interim director of the Celiac Center. And I'm also the executive director of the Kovler Diabetes Center. Some of you who are joining us today may also have diabetes or other autoimmune conditions. So we at the University of Chicago are here to help. Today's discussion is all about celiac disease. So this morning's sessions were fantastic. So Dr. Verma, our director, spoke. We talked a little bit about diagnoses and the difference between celiac disease. We talked about some really fantastic diagnostics. Dr. Jericho shared those with us, including blood tests and genetic tests. And then finally, our friend from Boston Children's, Vanessa, talked about how to help our children in schools, which I learned a lot about as a nurse and as a mom myself. It was tremendously helpful. So we will be sure to have all of these presentations available online in the future so that you can share them with loved ones and school personnel as needed, grandparents, caregivers. It's just so important. I also want to thank Meeting Achievements for putting this together today from a tech standpoint for us. Thank you again. And thank you to our amazing team that came together to create this event, given that it's so hard for us to be together. So sit back, relax, have a cup of coffee, bring a family member or friend in, or as I said, a child and or stuffed animal, whatever you need to do. The second session today is really focusing on medications, nutrition, and some really wonderful lessons learned by someone who has really experienced celiac disease firsthand. So thank you for the participants who are joining us for the second session. It's just amazing. We really appreciate it. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our friend, Dr. Francisco Leon. He's a physician and he is a researcher and has done some phenomenal work in the space of understanding and developing medications for use in celiac disease. Dr. Leon, welcome, and please share with us your expertise today.
Thank you very much. I just want to double check that you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. So let me share my screen. Good morning, and thank you so much to Dr. Verma for inviting me to this phenomenal panel and session that you have today. The University of Chicago Celiac Center is one of the preeminent centers in the country, and it's always a pleasure to speak with all of you and to exchange ideas and points of view about celiac disease. How are we going to continue working together to one day eliminate this disease? Just by way of introduction, I am the Chief Scientific Officer of Provention Bio. We are a biopharmaceutical company. We work in autoimmunity, and I've been working in celiac disease for over 20 years, almost 25 years. A number of companies such as Cellimmune, Alba Therapeutics, Glutenostics, etc. So I have an understanding of the history of celiac research and development, and I want to share that with you today. The first question we need to ask ourselves as drug developers when we look to help people with a disease is, do people need our help? This is not a trivial question. Do patients with celiac disease need a medicine or not? There are no non-dietary treatments for celiac disease. All we have is the gluten-free diet. And certainly the gluten-free diet has a high cost, but if it worked, it would be something that would eliminate the need for a medication. The problem is that all the science, all the research shows that despite our best efforts at the gluten-free diet, as little as 50 milligrams a day of gluten, that is a small crumb of bread equivalent a day, can trigger inflammation in the gut and the disease. And that is why we talk about gluten-free diet, non-responsive celiac disease. Basically, what this means is patients who are on a gluten-free diet but continue to experience signs and symptoms of celiac disease, inflammation in the gut, symptoms, gastrointestinal, extraintestinal, and this can affect as many as half of all the patients with celiac disease on a gluten-free diet. That is because gluten is so prevalent. It's everywhere in our food chain. 80% of the food in America contains gluten, and there are so many even non-food products that have gluten. So it's very difficult to avoid gluten. Patients report the gluten-free diet as extremely burdensome. This is a work by Dan Leffler showing that when they ask patients about the burden of their treatments, for example, hypertension, heart, diabetes, congestive heart failure, they rank different levels of burden of their treatment. It was very interesting that the most burdensome disease was end-stage renal disease. That means people who have to go on dialysis 3 times a week. It's a very burdensome treatment. Celiac disease was ranked second, only second to end-stage renal disease, meaning the gluten-free diet is felt by patients as extremely burdensome. And the problem is it doesn't work in half of the patients. So when patients were asked, do you want us to work on medicines? Almost 90% of the patients said they were interested in a medication for cross-contamination. And this is a very interesting article that was researched out of the University of Chicago. And many of the authors are the doctors that you know very well, Dr. Wandalini, Dr. Semrat, Dr. Kupfer. So very interesting observation that gave us renewed enthusiasm to try to develop a medication for celiac disease. The problem we have to develop medicines is that most of them fails. Most of them fail, and it takes a very long time to develop these medications. It costs a lot of money. For a single drug to be approved by the FDA, we need to have at least 5 or 6 in clinical trials because the failure rate is greater than 80%. And that means over 200 drugs in animal studies to get to that one single FDA approved drug. The total cost for this process is over $1 billion. We do have one advantage in celiac disease, is that we have a good relative knowledge of the pathophysiology of the disease or the mechanism of the disease. And this is a cartoon I'm sure you've seen a million times. This is the gut wall. Gluten crosses the gut wall and it's modified by an enzyme called transglutaminase. This gluten becomes now reactive against the immune system. It activates 2 important cell types, the lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and the intraepithelial lymphocytes, which are in between the cells of the gut wall, which are activated by interleukin-15. The T lymphocytes activate B lymphocytes, and they make antibodies that we can measure, the anti-TTG antibodies we can measure to diagnose the disease. So on the basis of this understanding of the disease, there was a first wave of companies that set to try to develop medicines in the early 2000s. In 2010, we had 5 efforts to develop medications. The first company in the US was founded by Professor Chaitan Khoshla out of Stanford. And this is the Alvine ALV-003 drug. It's a glutenase, which eventually would be developed by Immunogenics, but that was the first ever company. The company I was chief medical officer of, Alba Therapeutics, that was founded by Professor Alessio Fasano, was the second company with a larasotide drug to try to close the passage of gluten through the gut wall. Chemocentrics to reduce the migration of the lymphocytes. Immusanti, Professor Bob Anderson with a vaccine, NextVax2, and then James Cook University with Necatur, which is a worm that causes the opposite immune reaction to celiac. So if people have this infection, they have less celiac symptoms. So the interesting thing here is, of all of these projects, all of these companies, basically all of them have gone through setbacks. Alvine, Alba, and Immusanti no longer exist. Now their drugs, ALV-003 and larasotide, were picked up by other companies. So at least those two projects are moving forward. But Traficet, Nexvax2 are shut down, and the Necatur project has shown no benefit in the gut wall, only on symptoms, so probably is no longer moving forward. So this just tells you how difficult it is to develop drugs and the high rate of failure that we have. But do you have a reason to be optimistic? You do, because if you look at the situation today, we have a renaissance of celiac research. We have so many companies, so many groups that are now developing drugs. I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to share the message that we have drugs targeting each step of the mechanism of the disease. And that's very important because we will be able to combine them as well. So we have drugs to block the entry of gluten, now with 9 meters, drugs to block gluten inside of the wall of the gut, now immunogenics, Takeda, drugs blocking interleukin-15, like my company, Prevention, we are working with Amgen to block interleukin-15 and prevent the activation of the intraepithelial lymphocytes so that they don't destroy the gut wall. This is an important mechanism. Drugs to block transglutaminase, drugs to try to re-educate the immune system, picking up where Immusanti left it. Particularly Takeda is very active in this field, as well as Anokion. In green, you have drugs that are in clinical studies. In blue, drugs that are in animal studies. And I'm leaving my slides with all attendees, so if anybody has any question, I'm happy to take questions later, but the only message I'm sending right now is a lot of drugs in development, potential for combination. So we have now a good chance that in a matter of 5-7 years, 1 or 2 of these drugs will be approved by the FDA because some of them are in late stage. Larasotide is in phase 3. Our drug prevention drug of PRV-015 is in phase 2B. Those are the most advanced programs. And just a word about what we do at Prevention. We are a company that decided to focus early on the early steps of inflammation, try to prevent and intercept the disease. That's why we focus on interleukin-15, because interleukin-15 is a key early step in the damage that gluten causes. We have been working on this drug for a while with Amgen, and we proved that in the context of a gluten challenge, blocking interleukin-15 was able to reduce the symptoms and the inflammation in celiac disease. It's actually the first time a drug reduces simultaneously symptoms and gut inflammation in celiac as a response to gluten. So now we're very encouraged that we can take this into a greater experiment, the proactive celiac study. 220 patients will be enrolled. And here I'm making a plea to all of you. We really need participation of the Chicago Celiac Center community in this trial, because without patients, we cannot enroll, we cannot progress clinical trials. Our other program, and that's my last slide, is a vaccine to try to prevent the original infection, which in a good number of people causes the early loss of immune tolerance against gluten. And research over more than 25 years has shown that this virus, Coxsackie B virus, is the most frequent viral trigger of celiac disease and type 1 diabetes. So we have started clinical studies They're currently only in Finland, but in the future, they'll come to the US. And this will be a vaccine that can be given to babies, hopefully, and will prevent infection by this virus and then reduce the probability of developing celiac disease. So I just leave you with a thank you to all of you. Finally, after all of these patients, heroes who have participated in investigational trials worldwide, we have now at a tipping point in the celiac research field where we have enough medications to almost ensure that something will cross the finish line in the next decade. And I know this is still a long time ahead of us, but it takes time. We need to ensure what we do is safe and effective. So thank you to all celiac patients who make this research possible. Thank you to the Chicago University Celiac Center for all your work.
Thank you, Francisco. Peggy will be joining us. I know that there are some questions in the chat, and perhaps, first of all, I want to thank you that you and all the other groups in the pharma world are working together to get something out there. And as a parent of children with celiac disease, I guess I will tell you, we've heard this before, right? That we're going to get a medication, we're going to get a medication. But this is really encouraging to hear that the medications are going to be here, hopefully in this decade. I'm just going to start off with the first question that one person mentions in the chat, and then Peggy, you can take over. So Anne would be interested to hear if there are any therapeutics that are being evaluated for occasional cross-contamination exposure. Her daughter is totally fine with a gluten-free diet, but that occasional exposure is the problem.
Yeah, you know, the first thing I need to say is that even people who think are totally fine on a gluten-free diet, when you look closer, you look at the gut, that's where you see this 30%, 50% of patients on a gluten-free diet still have contaminating gluten in their diet, still have inflammation. So it's important that patients also realize that you might feel well enough, but the situation is less rosy than it seems in many occasions. And for that reason, a lot of these drugs we are developing act all the time on the body. They don't act only for cross-contamination, occasional cross-contamination, because it's very difficult to tell when will somebody get cross-contaminated. So in general, either drugs are meant to be given either pills or subcutaneous injections that you give yourself at home once a month, like a heparin or like insulin. In the case of our drug, is a subcutaneous injection. They will act all the time to protect you, even when you think you are not being cross-contaminated, just because it's so difficult to tell. Other drugs are being developed to be taken with each meal. The problem is there's also gluten intake between meals. So in general, most of the drugs are not developed for just occasional use. That's the short answer.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Leone, for your really honest assessment of opportunities out there, I think, for medications. I think a lot of us are maybe wondering where things stand with those medications that are close to market. So specifically, one of the questions we had was, of those that are close to market, what are some potential side effects? So what are the downsides of taking any medication that's close to market? So say, for instance, the FDA approves a medication tomorrow for, say, gluten exposure. What are some side effects that should be concerning, or what have we seen so far in early studies?
Yes. So the good thing is that the process is so strict that if a drug makes it through phase 3, phase 2B, you know that it has passed a lot of safety tests so far. What I can tell you, for example, about our drug, PRV-015, is that in our prior phase 2A clinical trial in celiac disease, we did not see any serious adverse event. There are adverse events related to, for example, injection. Some people will experience a little bit of pain at the injection site, but there were no increased infections or any other side effects that you might see with medications. In the case of larasotide in phase 3, it's a drug that it doesn't even get into the body. It works in the inside of the gut tube, in the lumen. So it also has so far been well tolerated without major side effects. So the more you progress in the development process, the safer the medications are, because those that are not safe, they are just abandoned in phase 1.
I can appreciate that. Many have been asking where to go for more clinical trials information. So some of the work that I'm doing as we're talking is making sure that you have accurate information on how to be part of a clinical trial. So there's a couple of sites that I want to mention, and then I will certainly put it more in the chat. So clinicaltrials.gov is a fantastic website that gives you information. You can type in a disease state and information pops up. There's also an organization called Beyond Celiac. They're a wonderful organization. We're not directly affiliated with them, so I can't speak to, the accuracy of every piece of information they have, but they have a great clinical research and clinical trials finder called trials.beyondceliac.org, and I will put that in the chat so we can educate you a little bit more. The University of Chicago Medical Center has some fantastic information about clinical trials that we're offering, but I think if you'd like to participate in more studies, we will make sure that we answer those questions. So Doctor, can you share with us, in addition to pharmacologic therapeutics, what do you think about the promise of genetic solutions, or whether it be monoclonal antibodies, or whether it be biologics or other genetic solutions, which companies maybe can help us with that, and they're not necessarily medications?
Yeah, let me clarify, because sometimes this gets confused. There are basically 3 types of medications, or 4 types of medications here. You have the traditional, what people call medicines, pills, capsules, pills taken by mouth. Those have chemical molecules inside, and they distribute through the body, and they typically are effective, but they bind all over the place. So usually they have more safety challenges. The second category is the biologics, as you mentioned, monoclonal antibodies, biologics. Those are injectable. That's the downside. But the advantage is they're extremely specific. They don't bind anywhere else than where they are meant to bind, in the body. So typically they are the safest drugs, typically. But they require an injection once a month to provide the drug. The third category would be vaccines, also injected, and to try to prevent the trigger of the disease. And then the fourth is genetic modification, as you said, DNA and other measures. Celiac disease is still not in a stage where genetic modification seems to be appropriate for celiac, because the genetic trigger of celiac disease, it's called the HLA. The HLA molecule is very, very important in immunity against pathogens, against bacteria and viruses. And at this time, we just don't know how could we interfere with that process without having some side effects. So at this time, for celiac disease, all the approaches are either pills and capsules with chemicals, or biologics, plus the vaccines to try to prevent the disease. We don't have genetic modification. There is genetic modification of gluten. There's several attempts to modify gluten. That is promising. The problem is, even if we were able to engineer gluten to not cause celiac, a celiac patient will have to only eat that gluten As long as you consume any other source, you will be back to the same problem. So that has challenges as well.
I can appreciate that. Thank you so much. Some questions and additional questions about just setting up appointments in general. So, really wanting an accurate diagnosis. So to set up an appointment with Dr. Verma, Dr. Verma is a pediatric and teen gastroenterologist. Please go ahead and send an email to Mark Jankosik. We'll put that info in. If you want more information about the teen program, you are welcome to email me directly. And then finally, if you have a question about seeing one of our adult GI physicians, we have many, you can reach out to me as well and I'll answer those. Dr. Leone, you were phenomenal. I cannot thank you enough for being with us today. You've answered so many of our questions. We will have more throughout the conversation. And what I'd like to do right now, if it's okay, is Dr. Verma, you did have a few slides and some follow-up that you thought would be helpful to provide. And now might be a nice time to do that, or we can wait until after Macy and Lori's presentation. So Dr. Leone, thank you again.
Can I ask Dr. Leone a question though?
Oh, please.
So I'm going to take the liberty of being one of the panelists and come on screen and ask you. So, there are a lot of people, or there's some people who would like to volunteer for different trials. And in terms of reassuring people that it's safe to, as you're with a reputable group that you're actually volunteering for, what would be so if I wanted to volunteer, what would you tell me that would make me reassured that I can volunteer for a particular trial?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Verma. I do need to emphasize that all experimental drugs are experimental. So that means there is always a risk, always a risk. A volunteer is someone who decides to take a controlled risk in order to help society, in order to help their children, future generations, and hopefully themselves as well by bringing about medications in a few years. So, as you said, it's very important to choose a reputable center such as Chicago University, because then you have the several layers of assurances. First, the ethics committee of the center has approved the study after looking at all the data, safety data, efficacy data. They consider that the benefit-risk equation is favorable in the sense that there is a potential for deriving benefit that is commensurate with the potential risk. You will be given an informed consent form and you will be allowed time to understand it, and it will be explained to you all the potential side effects, all the potential steps to conduct the study will be explained to you very clearly, and you can go home and think about it. You don't have any type of pressure to sign up. And finally, the FDA supervises these studies. The company supervises the study. So there are multiple layers of safeguards that will assure that you're not exposed unduly to any risk that it would make the study inappropriate.
Thank you. I think there are times that we want to do things and there's always that one sort of doubt in our mind. And then majority of the studies are usually done in adults first. So again, it's something that's reassuring for our children that we've done the trials and they're as safe as we know as we bring it to the children.
That's a great point. This is by law. The FDA will not allow a study in children with celiac disease until the drug has reached phase 3 in adults. So unfortunately, many times parents ask us, they say, my child needs help, I'd like to participate, but we can't until we have done the final studies in adults. That's why it's so important to encourage people to volunteer for the adult study so we can then start in children.
Dr. Leone, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
We are so grateful to have had you here. We look forward to welcoming you during our panel discussion. Dr. Verma has more to share, which I think I'll have her do after our next presenters. We have two fantastic presenters that I'm just happy to share with you today. So Lori Wellstead is just an amazing partner and a dietitian, a nationally recognized speaker. She's published, she's well-known, she's like a celebrity in the diabetes, or I should say in the celiac world, but maybe in the diabetes world we'll get you going too. And Macy Mears. So Macy is on the pediatric side of things, and Macy is a registered dietitian as well. Both Macy and Lori partner together between pediatric and adult care. And that is such a fantastic thing because we can then bridge the two to ensure that all of our patients with celiac disease get support throughout their life. So they are going to share this discussion and presentation today and talk to us about nutrition, the gluten-free marketplace, and labeling laws. Really tough to navigate nutrition these days, particularly for those with celiac disease who are trying to remain gluten-free. So thank you to our amazing speakers today, and specifically to our next up speakers, Macy Mears and Lori. Thank you.
Hello, nice to be here today. Thank you for having me. So yes, Macy and I will be discussing nutrition, the gluten-free marketplace, and labeling laws. So some of the objectives we're aiming to focus on for today will include some of the basics of the gluten-free diet, kind of the 101, reading some things with food labels, cross-contamination with regard to things at home, as well as other processed gluten-free products, some of the new exciting foods in the gluten-free marketplace, and then also really the importance of balancing the gluten-free diet. So we will touch on that. Macy will really be focusing on a lot of these other healthy and just natural alternatives in the gluten-free diet. Okay, so what does gluten mean? So in Latin, it means glue. So again, it provides that structure. So think of, again, I think the perfect example is this croissant. So it's flaky, fluffy, crunchy, crispy, all those different qualities that the protein that gluten can provide and impart in a product. So again, gluten is protein, and it's the storage protein of 3 different kinds of grains. So wheat is the gluten and the gliadin, rye, the secalin, and barley, hordein. And so these help to really retain moisture, extend fat, and then also protein. So again, even about 20 years ago, they used to even put gluten in a lot of different meat products in fast food. They've since taken it out. But again, when I was in my master's program, I remember learning a lot of this and being, my mind was blown. So it really was a way to kind of cheapen up a product, but it still was a way to keep the protein in the product. So we do know gluten is toxic in celiac disease. So some of the gluten-free diet basics. We know celiac disease is triggered by the ingestion of gluten. We recommend avoiding, obviously, wheat, rye, and barley, and then any foods that are derived from these grains as well. Only oats and oat products that are certified gluten-free. We will talk a little bit about the purity protocol oats as well. And really, when in doubt, leave it out. Especially even things like with oats, some patients just simply cannot tolerate oats. So there's no way I'm going to push that on a patient. But if they could tolerate it, it could be a nutritious grain, again, as tolerated. So this is kind of a old school acronym from really the year I started practicing in 2004. But it really spoke to me back then, and it still does. So how do we manage celiac disease, right? There is no magic pill. There is no treatment except for the diet. So, how do we start managing celiac disease? I think number one really is the consultation with a skilled dietitian. You really don't want to see a dietitian who specializes in heart disease per se, right? Just like when you go see a specialist, if you want to know this is a specialized GI, typically dietitian, and there's a lot more in the country, and there's different ways that we can find them much more easier in the past couple of years. education, again, about the disease, lifelong adherence to the gluten-free diet. So again, I can't tell you how many patients in the past 16 years have come to me. They were on the gluten-free diet when they were little, and someone told them they can, they were cured and they can go back on gluten. So it's really lifelong adherence at this time for celiac disease on the gluten-free diet. And then really identifying and treating any other nutritional deficiencies. Sometimes celiac disease is caught early on and you don't have these overt vitamin and mineral deficiencies. Some patients really go on for years, and that's where we could see other deficiencies that can occur over time. And then really some access to an advocacy group or a celiac disease center. Now I think with social media, there's a lot more access. Again, 20 years ago, it was quite a challenge, and even 16 years ago. And then continuous long-term follow-up by a multidisciplinary team. And again, once you are diagnosed, this is not something you have to see your physicians all the time, but really just kind of having that touch point so that you could follow up with your dietitian, your physician, just so that you have that access. And a lot of times we do see patients and they may have been lost for, many, many years and not seeing anyone. So I can't stress that enough. Okay, so some of the challenges, I would be, remiss if I didn't talk about some of this when you are really embarking on the gluten-free diet. So, patients may come to the clinic or now again virtually, and there's really this kind of initial shock of the diagnosis. Some patients are extremely happy that they found what their issue was, and others are really having to deal with mourning the loss of gluten. And again, it's something that it doesn't matter the age. I guess if you were really young and you didn't know what gluten tasted like, but I think, for someone who I see that might be 18 up to, 80, they still have had gluten in their lives in many different forms. And again, food is, is part of life, right? So I think we have to go through that mourning stage. And again, really addressing some of these different things, such as eating out, really trying to find those spots and talking through some of the different points of if someone is eating out and, how to maybe ask those questions. So parties are another big thing. So initially when someone is diagnosed and they're going to family parties, it could be overwhelming. So I think, I like to talk through, how to navigate that with patients. Again, trying to find what will help really keep your sanity and keep you just having that feeling of normalcy, right? So sometimes you do have to bring food, obviously with you. And so having those kind of things, I think for myself, having celiac disease, you really have to have a mixture of things. So I might need something crunchy and savory and sweet because it is challenging again. Feeling that deprivation. And truly before I was diagnosed for, many years, I really truly didn't feel that. And so now I think being a dietitian who has celiac disease, I can really relate with patients and try to really provide that specific tweaks for them for finding what they really miss. I think traveling is, in some ways has gotten, right now with COVID, it's a little bit, it's kind of decreased, but I think, some of those things to be mindful of so that you have things on you so that you're not just left very hungry and, hungry and angry. And then quality of life, Dr. Leone did mention some of this. We do know that if someone is extremely vigilant, it really can negatively affect their social and emotional wellness. So it also is associated with anxiety and fatigue. So I think it's trying to find that balance. We do want patients to be adherent to the gluten-free diet, but we really want to watch their quality of life and find some points of joy when it goes to adhering to the diet. I did want to touch on lactose intolerance. So I think a lot of times when individuals are diagnosed, they might read online that they may need to avoid dairy as well as gluten. And that's not necessarily the case. So as you can see here, it looks like a complicated picture, but I wanted to close up on these villi. So when someone has an endoscopy, they go down the throat, the esophagus here, and into the stomach. And through the stomach, right at the end of the stomach is where the duodenum or duodenum is located, the first part of your small intestine. And this is where we biopsy and we try to determine if an individual does have celiac disease. So we are biopsying these areas. And as you can see here in this highlighted area, that is what the villi, again, it looks like a carpet of hair. It's kind of fluffed up. And so interestingly so, if someone's first diagnosed, the tips of the villi is where the lactase enzymes are, and that breaks down lactose. Okay, so the challenge is if someone is first diagnosed and that carpet of hair is smushed down, so lining the intestine or very blunted, they may feel that, you know, whenever they consume dairy products, they might feel a little gassy and bloated. So typically in these cases, I'll recommend they could always try a lactose-free dairy product. They can try alternatives, but then really reminding them that they can try this again in the future. Sometimes it might be a couple weeks, a couple months, and they're all of a sudden those villi are fluffing back up, and they'll be able to tolerate some lactose. I think this is important. I can't tell you how many patients come in and they sometimes are avoiding so many things that they might not need to. And oftentimes patients may need to avoid lactose over time, but then they could still have things such as butter, hard cheeses that are just naturally lactose free, but they might be avoiding, again, in fear and misinformation online. Okay, so the gluten-free labeling law. So again, when I first started out many years ago, it was a mess when it came to reading a food label. You really had no clue if this food contained, you know, it was kind of the Wild West. So unfortunately in 2014, the FDA started a rule, and this rule was anything under 20 parts per million of gluten or less would be the end product, and that would be deemed gluten-free. So the product could be stating gluten-free, no gluten, free of gluten, and without gluten, and that would be deemed appropriate. Now, this does cover cross-contamination and imported products. I do want to point out that it does not require testing of the products by our FDA at this time. I like to say they really, truly, they have bigger fish to fry, and they don't have at this point the ability to go in and test every product that's out on the market. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the third-party testing that is out. This does include some packaged foods, vitamins and supplements. It does not cover alcohol, medications, cosmetics, or USDA products. And so on that point here, I wanted to point out some of these different things when it comes to the FDA and the USDA. So the FDA in 2004 started what was called FALCPA, or the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. Now this was huge because prior to this, there was literally nothing to tell you that a product contained milk or any of the top allergens. So again, for a lot of individuals that have small children now, that was basically, it was a nightmare, right? So when 2004 started this act, this was great for individuals with celiac disease, because as we know, wheat is the main ingredient that has gluten, right? So there's wheat, rye, and barley, but barley and rye are not top allergens, and they really will be specifically they'll be in the ingredient list. We'll talk a little about some things that could be a little questionable. So this made it really easy initially to try to find those obvious products that contained wheat. And so with this in 2004, they had to clearly state if a food or an ingredient contained an allergen, and it would either have to be in a parentheses statement after something like enriched flour, or it would be in a contained statement below. Again, like I said, it excludes barley and rye, but they're a little bit more expensive, and they will be specifically stated in the label. Then we have, and again, let's just remember that the FDA, they're governing more things like your cookies, your crackers, your cereals, pastas. USDA is governing things such as your meat, your poultry, your dairy, and then products that contain 2% or 3% of the raw or cooked. So thinking of things like your broth, your cans of soups, chilies, things such as that, even flavored milk products, that's going to be under the USDA. Now, fortunately, at this time, up to 90% of these companies are being transparent, and they're letting you know if there is a contained state, there will be a contain statement on some of those products. So it's made it a little bit easier, but we still want to reiterate the fact that you want to watch out for pre-marinated meats, soups that don't state gluten-free. There's a lot of things that are out there that could be a little bit questionable when it comes to things that are really kind of overly processed. So I kind of recommend my patients, when it comes to some of those USDA products, really trying to make sure that they state gluten-free, right? So if it's a can of like soup and it has a bunch of different things in there, you want to make sure it states that it is gluten-free. And then trying to get like naked meats or naked fish and not having them pre-marinated if it's a questionable label. So what is 20 parts per million? This could be quite confusing, even as somebody who specializes in this. It took me years back in the day to really wrap my head around some of this. So 20 parts per million is 20 milligrams of gluten per kilogram. A kilogram is 2.2 pounds, right? So what Tricia Thompson of the Gluten-Free Watchdog and the Gluten-Free Dietitian did, she measured things out. So these samples are all 1 ounce serving, which are 28 grams, and a half a milligram of gluten would be the 20 parts per million. So again, very detail oriented. And this was really something that helped me to put things into perspective. And really the weight of the gluten is important to note, right? So spices, so if you look all the way at the bottom right, she is holding up 1 ounce of paprika, okay? Now, that, say even if that did have gluten, you would have to personally consume that much paprika in a sitting to get enough gluten to that would even be at 20 parts per million, right? So same thing with medication. Yes, absolutely. Medication these days can have different things like, again, with yeast and probiotics and questionable things. But if it's something like a regular old hard pressed pill, as you can see there, you would have to have a lot in a serving. As you can see, there's like a Cheerios and then the pasta. So it can add up pretty quickly in some things, and then other things, I think we tend to worry a lot more. And I think a lot of patients really are concerned about so many things, and it's very overwhelming when you're first diagnosed. And even, like I said, as a dietitian with celiac disease, sometimes you just have to, kind of weigh the risks and the benefit. So I wanted to touch on a couple things here. So there was a study many years ago in 2007 in Italy, and they looked at how much gluten can an individual tolerate, right? So they did this over a 3-month period, and they gave these individuals 0, 10, and 50 milligrams of gluten over those 3 months or 90 days. And the conclusion was that 50 milligrams of gluten induced villus damage. So again, that carpet of hair with your villi is smushed down. So as you can see here at the left, Tricia, again, helping so many people like me who want that visual interpretation of what the heck 10 milligrams is or what 50. So there's a quarter at the top of the page here you could see on the plate, and that is 10 milligrams of gluten from wheat toast that she dispersed onto the plate. So I think it's something that we want to obviously be mindful of cross-contamination, but we really need to be realistic and whatnot when it comes to it. So I think this hopefully can be helpful. I think even for myself, living in a house where there is other individuals consuming gluten, you could get a little overwhelmed if you're tired and you think, oh gosh, what's going on here in the kitchen? And we are very safe about things, but I think for anyone, whether it's a parent or, a child, an adult, a teen, there's a lot of unknowns. And I think we have a lot more to learn over these years. So I just wanted to give you that. Hopefully that can give a little bit of peace of mind. And then I wanted to touch on something that is something that could be very, again, confusing: voluntary statements. So we just talked about laws and rules when it comes to your labeling of food. So that was the FALCPA. And so we talked about those contain statements, and that is regulated. Now with the allergen advisory statements, these, instead of saying contains wheat, blah, 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 any of those other top allergens, it will say may contain. It will say it's voluntarily added to labels. It is not defined by any kind of federal regulation. So there is some hope that there will be some movement on this, because it provides a lot of just anxiety for many individuals. You might pick up a product, it might say gluten-free on the front, you turn around and then you're like, wait a minute, it says it may contain traces of wheat. So even for myself, initially when I picked up a couple products, I was like, wait a minute, it's anxiety provoking, right? So again, if something might say it's made on shared equipment, or it's made in a facility that processes wheat. Okay. And again, these could be some statements that could make you pause a bit. I wanted to touch base on the fact that this whole may contain wheat was studied by, again, Tricia Thompson of the Gluten-Free Watchdog. They looked at about 330 products here that were tested, and they looked at things that did say may contain wheat or not, right? And so these 330 products, as you could see here, 314 out of them were under 20 parts per million. Only 9%, or 29 out of 314 actually had a contained statement, right? So, but then 91% of those things that were totally gluten-free, they didn't have any contained statement. Okay, well then we look at things that were over 20 parts per million, and they could, cause issues. And again, same thing, only 2 out of the 14 even had a contained statement. And again, 86% of the ones that were over 20 parts per million had no contained statement. So when this study came out, I was a little bit like, oh my goodness, it's a little overwhelming. But bottom line is, at this point, we have a lack of federal regulations for these advisory statements. And so at this time, really, consumers should not rely on these allergen statements 100%, right? So you should not solely base your choices on the presence or the absence of these statements. So again, more to come from this, but I think it's one of those things where you do see a lot of products that might be certified gluten-free, and then it will say some of these things. Now they're kind of, covering their rear ends in a way, because if someone does have a food allergy, they want to let them know that it is in that facility. But as we could see here, it's very wishy-washy of whether the product is safe or not with those allergen statements. So it just basically is making things more confusing. And so hopefully, again, I didn't confuse you further, and I can help you to at least decrease a little bit of anxiety. So I'm sure we'll have some questions on that. Sorry, Macy, I know I'm going over a bit here. So what about oats? Okay, so tolerated by most patients, there was a study in Norway that 22% of individuals developed an immunologic T-cell response. So basically, they were reacting like they would to gluten, to oat avenin, and avenin is a protein that's in oats. So that is a thing. So I think, if patients don't tolerate oats, I am not going to push them on it. And if they are going to consume oats, I want to push them towards the safer route. We do recommend, again, part of the Academy of Nutrition, the recommendation is less than 50 grams. So it's about a half a cup rolled, a quarter cup of steel, a packet of instant, and a half a cup of granola, because some of them are more dense than others. Again, not many people are eating like 3 cups of oats a day. But we do recommend, again, either doing certified gluten-free oats that are uncontaminated, that have been tested by a third party. The risk of cross-contamination, again, in regards to all foods, is the highest with oat products. Okay, so this is where we do really try to ask and see what oats someone is eating, especially if the numbers aren't coming down, they're not feeling better, just so we can kind of make sure that there's no inadvertent gluten getting into their system, right? And again, if it's something they're eating every day, we want to kind of know, like, what are the products you're eating? And then lastly, the purity protocol oats. So purity protocol oats are really a top tier. They're never grown with wheat, never shipped, processed, and whatnot. And so it's a higher standard. But again, if someone doesn't tolerate oats, they won't tolerate purity protocol oats. But it is something to keep in mind, again, when it comes to decreasing the risk of cross-contamination. So a couple other things when it comes to cross-contamination, we really want to, anything that goes in or around the mouth is suspect. So really trying to read the labels as ingredients change. Contamination, again, thinking about the kitchen. So as Dr. Verma mentioned earlier, just washing your hands. And those could be simple things that sound like, but even for myself, if I'm preparing something for my daughter that has a little bit of gluten, then I better wash my hands, right? So again, initially it could be overwhelming, but it just becomes second nature. Really being mindful of the prep area, the condiments. So again, we recommend using squeeze containers for condiments. Just to decrease that risk of double dipping. Or of course, labeling your own nut butter or whatever you might have that you can't put in a squeeze container. Cooking tools. So again, there are some new exciting studies with regard to cross-contamination, but at this time, we're still kind of recommending more conservative, having your own toaster or using toaster bags as needed. If you have a toaster oven, you can, again, wash the racks. I'd watch out for anything you put the toast down. But those are some things that we recommend. Colanders, again, gluten is glue. It can stick to those little crevices. Being mindful of cutting boards. Again, things like muffin pans that you might not think, that could be really cross-contaminated. Sponges in the kitchen. Cast iron pans are one that I've really recommended to be mindful of over the years. That's something that people don't necessarily wash, and they might use like oil to kind of clean it. So it's something that I would say trying to get a new cast iron pan. And then just being mindful of some of those old wooden utensils that might be a little bit worn, kind of crusty, if it was like a gluten, like a pasta spoon. And then just being mindful, we talked a little bit today about school daycare and some other things to keep in mind when it comes to cross-contamination. And then of course, meds and supplements. As you can see here, there's a bunch of different labels that are out there when it comes to gluten labeling. Wanted to touch on a few here. Here are 4 that you will see in the US and some of the different specifications. Again, each of these are a little bit different with regard to what they test the gluten to. Again, it's a third-party testing. And so again, it's something that you can look for on some of the different products that you're a little bit questionable about. Again, for things that are in shared facilities and things such as that. So I think this can definitely be helpful, but this is not something that I tell you have to have every single thing be certified gluten-free at this time. I know I'm running out of time. Just again, thinking of like when you are reading a label, making sure that if it is an oat product, that it is stating that it's gluten-free and you're not just doing a regular old granola bar. If it is a loaf of bread, as you can see here, it has buckwheat, but again, they do state buckwheat does not contain wheat. And then simple things in Chicago, we have a lot of corn crust kind of pizzas. And a lot of times they seem like they're gluten-free, but again, that cornmeal crust, the first ingredient is, unbleached flour that contains wheat. And then lastly, just wanted to touch on the new law that came out, or the rule, I should say, through the government in August of 2020. Hydrolyzed proteins are one of those rare birds. Again, it's things like your gluten-removed beer, some soy sauce, some probiotics. And so these products are basically, if you can imagine, like a gluten-removed beer. It contains gluten to start with, and then they use a kind of a cleaning process that breaks up the DNA of the gluten, and you lose some of that DNA. Well, it's hard to actually ever read those products to see if they are gluten-free. So at this time, again, the rule came out about this gluten-free labeling of these fermented and hydrolyzed foods. And again, if it is, they still are recommending not doing gluten-removed beers, and those cannot be deemed to be gluten-free because you are, you are kind of messing with the DNA of that. So again, hopefully some more to come from this, but this is exciting because there are a lot of different supplements and things that are questionable. Let's see here. I don't know. Let me see.
Right. Lori, are you good to just
Yes, I'm good to go. Thank you.
Great. Wow, thanks, Lori. That was all awesome. No worries about running out of time. We're just joining the same info here. Again, as people mentioned, I'm Macy. I'm a dietitian. I do primarily all pediatrics and then also teenagers for our celiac center. So this was all good, kind of like labeling. Now we're kind of switching gears and going based on just the general gluten-free diet. And I know we hear a lot about, you know, in the news outside of the celiac world, it's like, oh, a gluten-free diet may be healthier. But then once we jump into the celiac world, it's a lot more of like, oh, maybe the gluten-free diet isn't healthy. Can it be healthy? The simple answer is yes, it can be. And this is something I like to talk about, as well as Lori and most of us dietitians. But this is the My Plate, right? So this is how the Dietary Guidelines for Americans kind of visualizes how we recommend eating at most meals, which, as you can see, is half of our plate of produce or fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, which can include things outside of meat like eggs, nuts, legumes, dairy or dairy alternative, as Lori kind of touched on, or like a plant-based milk product for calcium and vitamin D. And then our grains, which the recommendations are over half of our grains should be whole grains. And that's where it gets a little bit like, oh, does this apply to the gluten-free diet? Yes, it does. We can make sure our grains are gluten-free, but I still want to make sure we're incorporating some gluten-free whole grains. And an example of something like a whole grain would be quinoa, whereas a refined grain could be like a refined cornmeal, white rice, or like cookies with like refined starches. So to go to the next slide, our naturally gluten-free foods are things like the fruits, the veggies, you know, meats like fish, pork, beef, chicken, and then dairy products like cheese, milk, whether that be soy milk, almond milk, or dairy milk. Grains like quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, just to name a couple, and we're going to go into that much more in depth. Other proteins like nuts and seeds, so like sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, nuts like almonds, or legumes like peanuts. And then a few others are things like, let me see here. Lori, can you go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Sorry, one back. I just want to make sure that everybody can visualize this as well. Thank you so much. So MSG, or the monosodium glutamate, maltodextrin, corn gluten, those are things that we might see on labels and might make us nervous, but those are gluten-free, as well as most vinegars, aside from like malt vinegar that Lori just touched on, oils, so like olive oil or canola oil, and then modified food starches, so most starches, particularly in US made or produced products. So then if we go to the next slide, more of the pitfalls would be things like some more of the USDA, so things containing meat, or things like broth, bouillon, sauces, the mixed soups, gravies, chilies. But again, like Lori already went through, label reading, we recommend reading every single ingredient, not just looking for a contain statement, as it's not necessarily the law that they need to put that contain statement on there. But if they do, if it is labeled gluten-free, still look through the ingredients, but that's what we recommend doing at this time. The gluten-removed beer, the malt vinegar, and malted beverages, as we mentioned, different marinades, dressings, miso, Play-Doh, soy sauce, can all contain wheat-based or barley or rye-based ingredients. Some teas, I know particularly there's tea called barley tea, and then some teas will have some additives, vitamins, supplements, medications, which we can look at glutenfreedrugs.com or ask our pharmacist to make sure that they don't contain that. And then I do just want to point out, because I do work all with kids, Play-Doh can be flour-based. There are also gluten-free Play-Dohs, but just as I was mentioning, as long as we're washing hands before eating snack or putting anything in our mouth, washing them very well, we can, most of us can touch gluten. Okay, so now that we've been through that, to the next slide, going back, picturing the My Plate and the whole grains that we're promoting. I just wanted to put this kind of, I know it's a lot of pictures, but put this out there because we hear about these things, but it's like, how do we actually incorporate those into our diet? So to just review some of these, and I really want to just point out, the reason we say whole grains, why My Plate, why dietitians like Lori and myself do promote whole grains, is that they're less refined, meaning they contain more fiber and different minerals like zinc, iron, magnesium, copper, as well as vitamins, particularly B vitamins, that are good to just help keep our, our blood levels the right level, our energy high, and help keep us strong and growing, particularly in pediatrics. And a lot of these grains, they look and taste and have very similar properties of things like our wheat, barley, rye that we're avoiding, but they're actually pseudo cereals, or we call like pseudo grains, meaning they're not from the same like species or family. So the amaranth that's in the middle, and the teff and the quinoa, this is hard as you're not like visually touching them, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen some of these. They're very small little grains, like almost like little seeds. And so those cook up with kind of like an opaque outer layer. And they have very similar properties, but quinoa is the biggest out of those. And then amaranth is a little bit smaller, and teff is really tiny. And then further to the right, you see the millet and the sorghum. I wanted to put this picture of the sorghum up because that on the right side of the bowl, it shows how the sorghum actually grows. And this is how millet and amaranth grow as well. And it looks like a seed and shakes off the plant just like a seed. And then going over to the left side, the buckwheat groats do have a different particular kind of flavor and look as well. If you've ever had a baked good with buckwheat in it, you know that it might be a little bit darker, or it looks almost gray when it's ground down into a flour, but it contains lots of healthy fiber and vitamins and minerals. And then below that, the tapioca. Tapioca actually isn't a pseudo cereal or a pseudo grain. It's a starch. And so it grows under the ground, just like a potato does. And it comes from cassava. So we can use that in the kind of the little balls that you might get in like a tapioca pudding, but you can also use it as tapioca starch. Oats, we discussed oats. If you are consuming oats, gluten-free oats, this is considered a whole grain, high in fiber. And it's less refined. So we do recommend that if you're able to consume those. And then wild rice is a good whole grain version of rice that grows just like rice does in shallow water, and it is a grass. And then over to the right side again, the chia seeds, flax seeds, these all provide kind of similar nutrients as these pseudo cereals do as well. But they are considered seeds, and they do contain higher levels of healthy fats that are great energy for us. So to go on to the next slide, kind of more of my point of what the heck do we do with these grains. Some ideas that Lori and I both like, but I'm sure that some of you all have some great ideas too, and we would love to hear them if you would like to share. But chia pudding is kind of a healthy breakfast option, snack, or even just like a treat. It's great because you can use any milk, whether or not you are following a lactose-free diet because of you're newly diagnosed and need to avoid that for right now, or you're using dairy. You can use any milk to soak the chia seeds for just a few hours or even overnight. And then it really lends itself to great flavors. You can add different spices or fruit purees, or even just like more nuts or seeds and fruits on top of it. Another idea kind of similar to that is overnight oats that I talk to a lot of my patients about. If your diet does allow for gluten-free oats, that you can use milk or yogurt, and then any flavors you want, and it's an easy on-the-go breakfast or snack. And then buckwheat is typically used in a flour, so like ground down, but you also can use it as groats, or that's like the picture that I showed in the slide, or it's like little. But buckwheat crepes and pancakes actually have a nice flavor. It's an earthy flavor, almost nutty as well. But I like to use it more so in already a gluten-free pancake mix that there is, and then add or substitute a little bit of the flour with some buckwheat. But you also can do full, like 100% buckwheat pancakes. They do just have a stronger flavor and texture. Risotto, so you can use short grain brown rice, and because risotto rice is a very short grain rice, to use, just like an easy, weeknight side or something to go with a protein. Ramen, you can use buckwheat noodles. I will say some buckwheat noodles are half flour, half buckwheat, but you can find there are multiple brands of 100% buckwheat noodles that are labeled gluten-free that you could use in like a ramen or a noodle soup bowl. Porridge can be a breakfast dish that's really just cooking down a grain or something like teff, or even amaranth works really well with milk or water, maybe some cinnamon, just kind of stewing that down and then serving it with some crunchy toppings. Sorghum, so this is the picture in the on the top. Sorghum actually pops like popcorn, but it's kind of fun because it's really small. It's like a really small kernel compared to popcorn. But it's kind of fun to do as an afternoon project or serving it as a little treat. And then you can sub quinoa in your fried rice dishes or use it half-half. Wild rice soup is a great way to use wild rice. And then tabbouleh, which is usually a dish using bulgur or cracked wheat. Millet, also amaranth does work well, and quinoa works really well with this. But millet has a nice kind of nutty flavor that goes well with these herbs. And traditionally, tabbouleh is like mint and parsley, onions, tomatoes, and some citrus and oil. So that's another way to kind of use some of these grains. So with the next slide, I just want to point out, again, I'm not telling you you have to eat all of these different grains that kind of sound super adventurous all the time. It's just that using or finding new ways to use some of these for our traditionally used items, such as white rice might be a staple at every single meal, that's fine. But we can also, we're always promoting variety. And so even if we can just find a couple dishes that we really like quinoa with, for example, nutritionally, there are benefits. So if we look here at this slide, we're comparing the same portions, cooked portions of long grain enriched white rice, which is pretty like a standard rice that's commonly used, and quinoa. So as you can see, the protein in quinoa is double. There's 5 additional grams of fiber in the same serving of quinoa. There's an extra gram of iron, and there's double the calcium. There's at least quadruple some of these vitamins and minerals that we talk about, particularly these minerals, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium, and double the zinc. And these are all things that, again, we can get from other parts of our diet as well. But if we find a grain that we like, that's a whole grain, it's an easy way to kind of fill in our My Plate and just gain an extra boost of nutrition. So then also going to the next slide, because pasta is also such a staple, and really the different kinds of pastas have really exploded in the last few years. So this is going across comparing some different brands of rotini. So the same shape of pasta, the same serving, and some really common ones starting on the left side are, and again, I'm not necessarily recommending any of these. I just like to compare them because these are 4 really common ones I hear about in my clinic. So Barilla is a corn and rice-based pasta, and then comparing it to a corn and brown rice-based pasta that also has quinoa added to it. So to compare those two, they have very similar fiber. So they have 3 grams of fiber per serving, very similar protein, 4 grams. And then the iron is just a little bit, just 1 milligram of iron. But then jumping over to the 2 on the right side, so we have a red lentil pasta that it's only made with red lentil flour. And then comparing it to a chickpea-based pasta that does have some different starches and added from and the gum just to help the like the consistency for when it's cooked up. But to compare just those two, those have about double the fiber of the corn and rice-based pastas. They have much more protein, over 10 grams of protein each. And then the iron is triple the amount of iron, and that's coming from the pulses or the legumes, the lentils and the chickpeas. And so it's a plant-based iron. But again, because pasta is such kind of a staple and it's served often. I like to point out the nutritional benefits of all pasta, but some different kinds of pasta too, especially if it tastes good and you enjoy. It could be an easy swap, especially with several brands are doing, you know, the like cups of mac and cheese, the easy on the go, also vegan options if you are dairy free as well. But use different, it's not just rice-based pasta anymore in those little convenient cups. There's the red lentil, there's quinoa pasta, there's different kinds that it might be worth checking out just to see if that's something you can incorporate into your regular everyday diet. So the next slide, kind of switching gears just one more time, because we're talking about all these new grains that maybe you haven't heard of all of them, but I do just want to also point out that wheat, barley, and rye, there are different kind of words for those that we also might not recognize. So something like spelt, we might think of that as, oh, maybe that's like teff or sorghum. No, spelt, kamut, and emmer or emer are all kind of ancient wheats. So they do contain gluten. Malt is another word for barley, as we know. Matzo is obviously, it's flour, wheat-based. Couscous is really just, it's not a grain, it's just it's a tiny shape of pasta, a wheat-based pasta. And then I also wanted to point out, oh, the triticale, so the one at the very bottom on the right side, that's actually a cross between wheat and rye and also does contain gluten. And bulgur, like we mentioned, is just another, it's cracked wheat. So these are all not safe for the gluten-free diet. But there are, as we saw, plenty of options as well. And so to go to the next slide, I know that a lot of the conversation, and I'm sure Lori has this conversation a lot with patients who are newly diagnosed or maybe just kind of, you know, getting to a certain stage of the diagnosis, that the gluten-free diet sometimes emotionally can lack something, so like variety, but that's also why we focus on talking about nutrition, because even just focusing on nutrition, if we frame it as we're focusing on just adding some variety, our nutrition is also boosted. But I also like to promote variety for quality of life, but also for peace of mind nutritionally, because as we know, the packaged ingredients, there are products, we have a ton of packaged gluten-free products. Some good, some not so good, but we're constantly coming out with new and more. So, you know, there are great cookies, there are great crackers, there are great, you know, muffins and baked goods. We're not really lacking on that. But sometimes when we start a gluten-free diet, we're so worried about finding those things that we forget our diet still needs the variety, including our fruits, our veggies, finding some of those whole grains, and different lean proteins, and a good source of calcium and vitamin D from dairy or a plant-based alternative. So we can either focus on finding whole grains or just picturing that my plate that I showed right at the beginning when I started talking, to make sure that our gluten-free diet isn't lacking nutrition or lacking variety, to make sure that we're filling in those gaps that oftentimes we see the gluten-free diet can lack, which is fiber, but also the B vitamins like folate, B12, niacin. Again, folate, B12 help keeps our blood healthy, and energy. Same with niacin, it helps us break down our carbohydrates to use for energy, so it helps keeps us strong and going. Our iron helps oxygenate our blood, keeps our energy up. Calcium is good for our heart, but also for our bones, which is super important when I'm talking with Dr. Verma to growing children. Zinc is good for our immunity, wound healing, and our taste and smell as well. So it is important to get all of these in our diet. So just to drive home the point a little bit more, with the next slide, again, when we start the gluten-free diet, we find good options, but it's important to not always think that just because the gluten-free options are healthier for us with celiac disease, which is true because gluten obviously isn't healthy, the gluten-free options might not always be healthier than the comparative gluten-containing options. So like a regular English muffin might have almost half the amount of calories than the gluten-free muffin that we switch to. And also the gluten-free options oftentimes have added sugar or refined carbs or starches. and fats. So as this one, you can see that this gluten-free muffin has almost 15 more grams of carbohydrates, as well as some extra fat. And then the next slide, I like to show this one, again, just because this is kind of a popular product with patients, but to kind of drive home 2 points. One, nutritionally, but B, with label reading and picking up this product. A lot of products that we see, the gluten-free option doesn't necessarily look totally different than the original option. So being careful in the store, picking it up, making sure it has that gluten-free on it, and even turning it over, because even if you didn't notice the organic versus the gluten-free on the packaging, you would then see organic whole wheat flour versus, you know, not starting with that, like the whole gluten-free, the brown rice flour, and that mix, that would also, you know, let you know. It's also important to, because I know a lot, especially during COVID, a lot of us have started, you know, ordering groceries online. Sometimes it's super easy to just have whoever's getting or filling your cart make this mistake. So double checking everything before eating it or before putting it away in your house. And then nutritionally, just to point out, so on the left side, we have the just original gluten containing waffles. And so compared to the gluten-free on the right side. And so you see that the gluten-free does in fact have more calories, less fiber, and more carbs, and less protein. So again, just kind of all around, just it's a different product, right? It's a different waffle. But again, that's not that you can't enjoy this product. In fact, we want you to enjoy this gluten-free waffle, but just remembering that we have to fill in our diet with other things like our fruits, veggies, other whole grains at a different meal. And so to go to the next slide, and I know Lori might want to make a comment on some of these too. These are just a few of the products that Lori and I put together that are definitely kind of new and hot topics in clinic. Particularly, I'm hearing a lot about the gluten-free Oreos and how exciting that's been. Lori, I don't know about you. Are you hearing about this in your clinic too?
Yes, yes. People are very excited about the gluten-free Oreos, and they are certified gluten-free. They do contain oats. So if you have issues with oats, I usually recommend just obviously be mindful of that. Sorry, I just realized I didn't put my video on. And then another one I did want to touch on too is the Char. Has a couple new products. There's the croissants, and then I'm trying to think of the other one, the pastry puffs. They do have wheat starch, but it is gluten-free. So it could be a little bit alarming for some people. Again, it's been tested, it's under 20 parts per million, but it really, that wheat starch has been used for years in Europe, and it helps to impart that kind of like a gluten effect, but there is no protein. So I did want to put that one on here. Obviously the Kraft mac and cheese too is, I think people are excited to try it and find it, and it's pretty affordable compared to some of the other ones. And then also the Banza, like you mentioned, I think that's another one. Patients like to at least find a gluten-free one. Oh, and then the Italia pizza, I really enjoyed that. It's from Colorado, but it's the first like organic rising dough. So it's exciting. You can get it shipped to you. But I thought that was kind of an exciting new one since the pandemic for me.
Definitely. These are all like good comfort foods too.
Yes.
And then do we just want to go to the next slide? Just to show the resources that you had listed.
Great.
How are we doing on time? Yeah, so just some different resources. So some different things that I've used over the years. Also, I think if people are into cooking, the How Can It Be Gluten-Free by America's Test Kitchen is awesome. You can really get into the fine details of like why you would substitute, and they kind of rate things. So I think that's kind of a nice one to check out for a reference. Of course, our website has a lot of good information as well. Yeah.
Great. I can't thank the two of you enough. Lori and Macy, bravo. Thank you so, so much for your insight and expertise. What a phenomenal program and information about all things gluten-free and how we do our best to try to navigate this. So thank you again. We do have a couple of questions, but I wanted to connect with Dr. Verma to know if she would like to impart some wisdom on how to follow up with us in our clinic. You could share a few slides, Dr. Verma, now if you'd like to do so. It might be an interesting segue because many people have asked questions in addition to the food questions, which, by the way, Lori and Macy, you have access to these questions in the Q&A, right?
Yes.
Great. Can you put some answers in, perhaps, while Dr. Verma and I are talking? Dr. Verma, it would be amazing if you could share your slides on follow-up, and we can spend about 10 minutes because a lot of the questions that we've had have been, how do I see Lori? How do I see Macy, right? So in addition to programs and events like this, how do we follow up and how do we get Lori and Macy to our computers or in person to ask questions? So Lori and Macy are partners with our physicians in the clinic. And the beauty of that is we can see our patients with a physician and with a dietitian at the same time. So you have to be part of the University of Chicago system to see Lori and Macy, unless I'm wrong about that, Lori, is that correct?
Yes.
Cool.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Okay. Great. So Ritu, would you like to share some slides with us now?
So I know this was not on our
It was not.
agenda.
This is like a surprise, like a big woo surprise about how to follow up, because once people are diagnosed, Dr. Verma, it's really hard for them to figure out like when to come back and see us. When do you come back and see us and why?
Right. So there were lots of questions from the audience about follow-up. So we thought that we would just put something quickly together and be able to answer some questions. So the question always comes on is, why should I really follow up? If I have a disease and you've told me I need to go on a gluten-free diet, I can go on all these websites. So why should I really follow up? So there are several reasons, and I very, very strongly feel that a follow-up for celiac disease is as important as following up if you have diabetes or if you have rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or Crohn's disease. And the reason is because there are complications that occur from celiac disease. So we want to monitor those. You want to monitor the complications of the diet. You just heard Macy and Lori talk about the good things about the diet and the bad things about the diet, and what are the nutritional deficiencies that can happen. I also think that providing the developmentally appropriate guidance about the disease and diet are important. So if someone gets diagnosed when they are 3 years old, basically we're talking to the parents or with other guardians or anyone else. But as that child from 3 becomes 6, he or she may listen to you and say, okay, I'll follow a gluten-free diet. But we as providers need to be able to educate them in terms of why do they need to stay on a gluten-free diet. And hence, I recommend that the children come back and be seen and get appropriate guidance and education about the actual disease. And the education obviously should be for patients, families, and providers. So again, you saw this slide in my previous talk about the non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And for follow-up, it should not just be the pediatrician. It should not just be the gastroenterologist. It really should be the team. Every follow-up visit should have the physician, nurse, dietitian, and if one has a psychologist or social worker in that team, would be really, really appropriate to have as a team. So what do we do in terms of our follow-up? So again, there are no firm guidelines. What we know is that once you get diagnosed with celiac disease, for the first couple years, you need to see your team at least every 3, 4, 5 months. And sometimes we see them every month. Again, all depends on how ill the child is. It depends on how much information as a family one can absorb in the first visit. You could just imagine trying to learn everything about celiac disease in a half hour. So there are really no firm guidelines. The only guideline that I have for the first couple years is based on the family. If it seems to me that the family needs a little bit more hand-holding, a little bit more guidance, we'll see them more often. If it seems that you're on the ball and you know what needs to be done and there aren't any stresses, and when I say you, I mean actually the child, so that the child needs to be in control of their disease. So first couple years till your blood work, till your antibodies become normal, every 3, 4, 5 months, again, nothing firm, but should happen. And as I said, the team should see them together. So what happens during these visits? We obviously look at the height and weight and look at trends before the diagnosis, after the diagnosis. Again, some children, after they've been placed on a gluten-free diet, their intestines are absorbing very nicely. So sometimes there might be a little bit of an excessive weight gain. So we really need our dietitians to help kind of come in and talk about some healthy eating, healthy gluten-free options, and so on. The height needs to be monitored very closely because, again, if you started off with short stature, we want to make sure that as you're on a gluten-free diet, as your weight is going up, your height is going up as well. If the height is not going up, but the weight is, and your celiac disease is under control, then we would refer you to someone in endocrine, so doctors who actually manage the height for other reasons than celiac disease. So growth is a huge thing for us in our follow-up appointments. Each appointment, we need to look at the symptoms. So what did you have before you saw us, before the diagnosis was made? And now that you've been on a gluten-free diet, what's happening to pain, your bowel movements, headaches, and so on. So some children may have no symptoms before they get started on a gluten-free diet. And when they start on a gluten-free diet, they actually start having more symptoms like pain and constipation. Again, part of it is what they're eating. So if you're eating a lot of processed gluten-free foods, you might unfortunately end up with constipation if there isn't a whole lot of fiber. So very important, again, for us to listen to you, listen to the children, and see, is there an improvement in the symptoms that were there before the diagnosis, or are there new symptoms that have come on? And if there are new symptoms, then do we need to refer you to someone else? Because obviously you could have celiac disease and something else. We would not be ignoring those symptoms. If the symptoms are ongoing, we need to sit down together as a team and say, well, we expect that maybe the tiredness will not improve in 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, and these are the things we need to put in place. So we would have a dialogue so that you're not that alarmed about symptoms that are ongoing. The next thing that we talk about in our appointments is to really talk about what is happening. Is the child going to school? If they're going to school, just like you heard from Vanessa earlier, that we bring in discussions about the school. We talk really what happens in school. Are you being told to sit by yourself? Of course, we do not like that. We do not allow that. And we would work with the school as well. So I know I see a lot of my patients with Macy. Macy will pick up the phone. I'll pick up the phone. Our nurses will pick up the phone and talk to the school nurses or talk to the school teachers to help you with that. But the 504 plans that Vanessa outlined for us, those are really ideal, and we would talk about it at that time as well and see how have you been able to do it, has it been a problem, and so on. We would also talk about the eating out and if there are kitchens at home. So sometimes what happens is that when we get diagnosed with celiac disease, us as parents, we take out everything that is gluten in the home. Some people will keep both gluten and gluten-free in the kitchen. So we sit down and we have a lengthy discussion about how do the other family members deal with all this. So I can give you my own example. I have 2 children with celiac disease and 1 who does not. And when they were diagnosed, when my youngest, who was diagnosed first, and he was 6 years old, and when he was diagnosed, I tell everyone, I was a mad woman. I took everything gluten that was out of the home, every little piece of anything that could be related to gluten. Did not really think that I had a middle child who did not have celiac disease. And I sort of punished her because the other 2 had been diagnosed. So I often will talk about my experience, listen to your experience. If you have a 3-year-old who gets diagnosed with celiac disease, it's hard to keep a dual kitchen. It's very hard. Others might be eating cereal that has gluten in it on the floor. And yes, your child might be walking around and picking it up. So again, we have individualized discussions for each family. We talk about how family events are, Thanksgiving, how did you manage that? Especially in your first year of diagnosis. So we will sit down and have that. And this is a reason for a follow-up. So maybe Thanksgiving 1 year was great, but the next year maybe not. So that's a discussion to be had. The dietitians, and they will go through significant details. I mean, it is details to the point of what did you eat and drink starting in the morning. And I love Macy's phrase when she and I do visits together, and she'll say, walk me through a day. Let's start with you woke up. What did you do? So assessing the diet compliance needs to happen at each visit, because I might be compliant now, but I've had celiac disease now for 4 years. And you know what? I ate gluten one day. I didn't have any symptoms. Maybe I'm not that compliant. So again, important to have that discussion with the dietitian and the physician that if you were exposed to gluten, did you have any symptoms? If you did not, it's still not the right thing to do. So let's talk about it. Let's see how we can go beyond this barrier here about diet compliance. Again, we assess the knowledge of the disease and the lifestyle adjustment for that age group. And that is why in pediatrics, it's really important that we see the children so we can talk to them. The children will talk to you, but they will talk to us in a very different way, so that we would be able to talk to them and see, okay, did you have a problem going to school and everyone else ate a cupcake and you didn't get a cupcake and your parents said, ah, no big deal, it's only a cupcake. No, we would talk about that and see how we can help the child and help you in terms of how to handle that situation. We definitely urge that everyone have follow-up appointments to get the education that is based on the particular age group for the children, and also education for the families. As I said, discussing the 504 plan is important. What else is needed in a follow-up appointment is family screening. So we talked about that earlier in the day about the genetics behind celiac disease and how there is an increased incidence of celiac disease within families. So family screening, the frequency has not really been established. Everyone sort of does their own, but we all agree as physicians, gastroenterologists, that family screening should happen. I'll tell you what I do. I usually will recommend family screening once a year, so long as the other family members are eating gluten. And the reason I say once a year, it's easy to remember. So every year, every June, you get family screening done. It's a family event. Everyone's doing it together. Some people would say you do it every 3 to 5 years or so. I tend to do every year till the child reaches puberty. And then I say every few years, unless you have symptoms. And the same should be for adults. Parents should be screened every few years, unless they have symptoms. And it's really important to get the screening, and the screening is the blood test that Dr. Jericho talked about with the antibodies. Discussion about screening, people will talk about the genetic testing. Do you really need to do genetic testing? I think it's a very individual thing, and it's a discussion that should be happening with your provider, a total discussion that should happen, whether the genetic testing should be done or not. But the antibodies should be done so long as the family is eating gluten. Bone density is something that at one time we used to say everyone who gets diagnosed with celiac disease should have a bone density. Over time, we've sort of changed our philosophies a little bit and said that if someone has vitamin D deficiencies, chronic vitamin D deficiencies, not taking enough calcium, growth issues, then you do a bone density. And we've sort of backed off a little bit on yearly bone density. If you've had frequent fractures, again, a bone density should be done. So blood work is important. Again, what's the frequency? Again, variable. If your baseline blood test is abnormal, then you do it sooner. The first couple years, your celiac panel should be done, the serology, the antibodies that Dr. Jericho talked about, should be done every 3 to 4 months till they become normal. Once the antibodies are normal, then we recommend once a year the antibodies should be done. You come in for a visit, you see the physician, you see the dietitian, you see the psychologist if need be, get your blood work done and have a discussion. Besides the celiac panel, the serology, we also like to monitor iron, the liver, thyroid, because all those are complications, potential complications that can happen with celiac disease. So monitoring all these once a year, once you're stable, is very important. The repeat upper endoscopy is questionable again. If someone is not doing well, we talk about doing an endoscopy. There are discussions among the celiac world that an endoscopy should be done after a few years. Again, that's to be discussed with your own individual provider. There are no rules that everyone should have an upper endoscopy. Children, adults get upper endoscopies done as follow-up. For children, it's not a rule that every child should get that. I'm going to just leave at this slide. please do not forget, get the 504 plans. It will help the children, it will help you. And in colleges, it's not called 504, it's you have to join the disability office. So again, very important. So I'm going to just stop right here, and Peggy, you can take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Verma, this was super helpful. We had so many questions on and offline about how to follow up and when to follow up. We have a special speaker with us today, and we're truly grateful to have her with us. So Priyanka Chu is a physician at Mount Sinai Hospital, and she is a phenomenal gastroenterologist and advocate for those dealing with celiac disease. She also happens to be Dr. Verma's daughter, which is pretty cool. And I just think that's amazing. As a nurse, and my mother is a nurse, I have spoken at many events with and for her, and I just am so grateful that you're here today to share your perspective and your personal journey and give us some hope and some advice. So Priyanka, take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Let me share my screen. All right. So like Peggy mentioned, I am a physician, but I'm not here for that purpose. I'm here to talk to you as a patient. So yes, I do have celiac disease. I'm actually a general surgery resident at Boston Medical Center, but I was diagnosed with celiac back when I was 12 years old. And so I have, kind of gone through celiac disease from the beginning, gone from being diagnosed when I was in middle school, done high school, college, grad school, medical school, and now residency. And I kind of had a lot of lessons that I learned along that way. And so I kind of wanted to share a little bit of what I've learned and how that can maybe, help you. And there was a lot of information that you all got today, but this is today going to be a little more about the feeling and the emotion and kind of the real life of being a patient. And we don't have very much time together. So I put my Twitter and Instagram handle up there so you can connect with me outside of this, because we're going to kind of go through this quickly. But the first biggest lesson that I learned for myself was to inform myself and to educate myself. And I think that comes a lot into, we were talking about having follow-up visits and understanding what's happening in your body when you're diagnosed with celiac disease. I think for me, especially because I was asymptomatic, understanding that, when I eat gluten or if gluten gets into my diet, these are all the things that happen down the line. And I think for me, as someone who is asymptomatic, that helped me stay true to the diet. That helped me understand that, okay, if I eat something with gluten, X, Y, and Z thing is going to happen. Now, I took that a little bit far and went to medical school and became a doctor, and not everybody needs to do that. But, at least having the baseline knowledge to be able to understand what's happening to your body is so, so helpful to be able to stay gluten-free. And with that knowledge, you can educate other people. And I think, for me in the beginning, I was frustrated. I was very, very frustrated that people didn't understand what was going on. Again, I was diagnosed when I was 12. So that's, I'm 29 now, so you can do the math. But the information that's out there is so varied and so wrong. And I'm sure you've gone through the internet, especially when you're first diagnosed, reading all these things. None of it makes sense. And it made me really frustrated and really angry. So I think educating yourself first so that you can educate other people was a huge thing that I did for myself, and that I think, most people should try and do. And then joining a support group and getting involved. That was another big thing. I think Vanessa mentioned this a little bit in her talk earlier, finding community and finding people that you can connect with. I think there's a lot of ways to do this on a national level. So like others have mentioned earlier today, Celiac Disease Foundation, Beyond Celiac, these are national organizations that you can get involved with and you can advocate on a national level, but they're on a more personal level and a local level. I think that's what's even more important. So the University of Chicago, we're already here today kind of connecting with each other, and it's a lot harder in COVID times and when everything's virtual, but the University of Chicago has their own support groups. And if you're not part of this, system, you can become part of the system, or, you can get involved with whatever local group is near you. So I think finding other people that you can talk to. And I've been doing this since I was a kid. So when I was first diagnosed when I was 12, we had a support group back in Philadelphia, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And that was where I first made a lot of connections with other people. And then I also, when we, again, get past pandemic times, whenever that may be, there are camps that you can go to. I went to Camp Celiac starting when I was 12 and when I was first diagnosed, and I'm going to share an embarrassing photo with you all. So this is when I was, I think, 14 years old. These people here, they were all other kids who had celiac, and I, made connections with them. And still to this day, we reach out to each other. We talk about, recipes, we talk about, things that we're having trouble with, or if we go to a new city, we see like who has been there before and what other, options there are for food. And it's makes such a big difference to have that support and have that community. So I'd say, a huge thing that I learned and that, I would say for everyone else is to find other people that you can talk to about this, because it's not something that most people can relate to. It's something that we deal with every day, 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We have to think about what we're eating, and most people don't understand that. So finding your community and finding people that you can connect with makes a huge difference. And then with that comes being your own advocate. So something that my parents did for me at an early age was encourage me to be the one who is having those conversations. So you go to a restaurant, you have to order from the menu. You have to ask all those questions about, what happens in the kitchen, what goes on behind the scenes. And I think that the earlier you can teach your child, or you as a child or a teenager can step up and have those conversations, the easier it's going to be as time goes on. They're really awkward conversations to have. I'm going to be totally honest. I really can't stand doing it sometimes. It makes me super anxious to have to be that person who's being really quote unquote difficult, or making a scene or whatever, but it's important. It's necessary for our health. And I think that, learning earlier, creating your little elevator pitch, the thing that you'll say every time that you go to a restaurant or every time someone offers you something that, you can't eat, makes it a lot easier. So getting used to doing that early is super important. And then on top of that, teaching the people around you to be advocates for you. So for example, my sister, like my mom mentioned, she doesn't have celiac, while my brother and I do. And she has learned to be probably a better advocate for us than we are for ourselves. For example, I relatively recently applied for residency. And for anyone who doesn't know, medical residency and the application process involves flying around the country, interviewing in different cities all over the span of about 2 months. So I spent 2 months in a different city every couple of days, not knowing where I was, not knowing what I could eat. And it was exhausting. And I was so burnt out some days, like I couldn't even contemplate calling a restaurant. I couldn't even think about asking all those questions. And it was so great to know that I had my sister who'd been trained basically to be an advocate for us too. And she was able to call restaurants for me and order food for me and help me get everything that I needed. So not only being your own advocate, but training those around you to be advocates too. And then it is so important because we have to do this all the time. Like I said, this is a 3 times a day, every single day activity, right? We have to have these conversations. We have to think about our food. Thinking about flour like this already freaks me out. So I apologize for this traumatizing video. But we have to stay safe. There's no cheat days. This is not a Weight Watchers. This is a diet, like it's a lifestyle. So we have to be able to have these conversations. We have to be able to advocate for ourselves, and we can't take any risks. So getting used to all of that early is super important. And I think another way that you can facilitate that for yourself is by becoming a top chef, not literally necessarily, but getting comfortable in the kitchen. And that's something that, especially in my transition from high school to college, was really important. Getting used to having, simple things around that you can make a quick meal with is really important, because you go to college, everyone's going to have their pizza and their cake and whatever and their dessert, and you want to be able to say like, no worries, I have my own food, or no worries, I'm going to cook for everyone. And kind of have that in your back pocket as something that you can do for yourself, and it's a lot of fun. So I think getting comfortable in the kitchen early on is really helpful. And then again, like I said, this is hard. And this is kind of, if you have to remember anything from this talk or anything from what I'm sharing with you today, is that this is not an easy disease to deal with. I think, Dr. Leon mentioned it perfectly. Like, we are the next most difficult thing to deal with after end-stage renal disease, because this is a social disease. Like, our lives in this country revolve around eating, right? It's a very social activity. And so you're going to feel really terrible sometimes. And I felt really terrible sometimes. I felt like I don't want this. I just want to be a regular person. I don't want to have to think about it every single day. And then I kind of shift to other days when I'm like, whoa, I'm super involved with celiac disease. I'm going to find every gluten-free restaurant. We're going to bake every gluten-free thing. And it's okay to go back and forth. But when you get knocked down, when you feel terrible, you have to pick yourself back up. So I think that the way to do that is to, again, have your support system, have your, medical support system, have your doctor, have your dietitian, have your psychologist, and own the fact that you might need those things. I've used those things. Everyone's used those resources to get through the downs of this disease. So you might get knocked down, but pick yourself back up. And then a way to also try and do that is to share your story. So I started writing a blog back when I was in grad school and was feeling really low about having celiac disease. So I started writing about my journey, writing about things, connecting with other people in the community. And especially now in, times when everything's virtual, this is a really great thing to do. You never know what sharing your story could do for someone else and what it would do for you. So you can connect with other people, you can help someone. And so it's really been rewarding for me. And the other thing that I tell every single person who I meet when they're first diagnosed with celiac is to never, ever let having celiac hold you back. It didn't hold me back. The biggest question people ask me when they're applying to college is, did I pick my college based on whether they had gluten-free food? And I always say 100,000% no. I picked the place that was perfect for me as a person, that was perfect for me educationally, that socially, that I felt like I would fit in. And then the food will sort itself out afterwards. Vanessa mentioned so many great resources earlier. The Americans with Disability Act has made a huge difference for us. I just registered with the disability office when I got to campus. There's a lot of things that you can do after the fact, but you have to be a person first. So don't ever let having celiac hold you back. And finally, the last thing I want to say, especially for everyone who's been newly diagnosed, is that it gets better. I know I said that there are a lot of ups and downs, but the ups and downs are less frequent than they used to be, or the downs are. And the learning curve of celiac disease is rough. The beginning is really hard. The trying to read labels, the trying to figure out what you're doing, if you can eat this, if you can't eat that, is really tough. But once you get all of that basics under your belt, it gets a lot better. So, take that as you will. Those are my 10 lessons that I've learned over my, 17 years almost now of having celiac disease. And there are plenty more, but that was just, a quick thing. So feel free to, ask any questions or reach out to me after this, social media, Twitter, Instagram. I'm available.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. For some reason, my video is not working. So I'm going to click on start my video, but it keeps saying I can't. Oh, I'm on. Hi, everyone. Priyanka, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions. I want to see if these are for you. I think we covered it. I think those were the main questions. I think what's so fabulous is that in a world of social media and in a world where we have a lot of young people who are trying to deal with the challenges of celiac, we want them to be able to connect with you. So I just actually was on Instagram while you were talking, and I'm checking out Anti-Wheat Girl, and you are connected with a lot of great people too. So for those who are on this program today, it's okay if they follow you, right, on Instagram? Okay, fantastic. And to be honest with you, you just fantastic information and personal experience, and we'd love to have you back. I think it would be awesome for you to maybe connect with young adults and teenagers as we're launching our in-transit program at the University of Chicago. So thank you. And of course, I introduced you as a GI doc. You're not. You're a general surgery resident, and good for you. And we need more female surgeons in the world. So thank you. You got it. Thank you. And we're just looking forward to watching you in your career and partnering with you down the road.
Thank you.
Great. We'd love to have you join us as a panelist too. So those who are on right now, who are speakers today, show yourselves. Hi, Dr. Jericho. Thanks for being here again. Hi, Vanessa. Lori's on. Macy. Great. Dr. Leon is popping on. Fantastic. Please feel free to put your questions in. One of the questions we did have, which was very interesting, is about growth and about those who maybe have growth issues or had growth issues, and maybe they're 18 or 19 or 22, and they do start finally eating a gluten-free diet because they're newly diagnosed with celiac. Are they going to grow as adults? It certainly depends on so many things, right? Hormones, bone density. Dr. Jericho, you want to take this one? It's a tough one.
Sure.
You know, it's hard for people who maybe had growth issues their whole life, and maybe it was related to celiac and they were diagnosed late. But, you know, at what point can we possibly see some growth changes? At what age?
Well, I guess it depends on what growth parameter you're referring to. So
height, maybe height. Let's start there.
Right. So unfortunately, and this is a very interesting topic, and we had written an article on this a number of years ago about the extraintestinal manifestations of celiac disease. And the issue is, once you pass puberty, unfortunately, the ability to attain more height is typically very, very diminished. You know, you do always have those late bloomers, but the likelihood of attaining significant height growth after puberty goes down dramatically. What we have found, though, in our patient populations, we looked at parameters of patients over a 24-month period after strict adherence to a gluten-free diet to look at how quickly they resolve. And we did find that almost all symptoms that seem to be related to the diagnosis of celiac disease did resolve both in children and adults by about the 24-month mark, much quicker in children than adults. If a child is prepubertal and still has potential for growth, and you can always do things like looking at bone age on the patient and, you know, where they are with that, and looking at growth plates to see if they're still open, to see if people have the potential for growth. So if a child is prepubertal and has the potential for height growth, we did find that children should attain what their expected genetic potential is for height growth, so long as you treat celiac and it's well controlled and the gut is healed in that time frame that they still have the capability of attaining height. If they don't, and what we found, I believe the number, I'm trying to think back, was somewhere between 10 and 20%, that if they don't start picking up the height and they do have the potential, you need to start looking for other diagnoses. Do they have something like a growth hormone deficiency? You know, sometimes people have conditions like Turner syndromes or other conditions like that that are missed that predispose them for shorter height. So if the child really has celiac disease and has the potential for improved height growth, they're prepubertal, and they appear to have well-controlled disease and are not increasing their height potential to what is expected, you do need to look elsewhere. Unfortunately, if they pass puberty and the growth plates are closed, height likely is not going to be improved upon as an adult. With regards to weight, again, once the gut is healed and you are absorbing nutrients properly, and as everybody said here, having a dietitian is of the utmost importance to not only ensure the diet's gluten-free, but that the patients are adhering to it in a very healthy and complete manner and getting all the nutrients that they need, then people should, again, put on weight to the point that they should be back in a healthy stage. You know, I think, as our dietitians had brought up before, sometimes the problem with gluten-free diets is to compensate for the lack of gluten, they can be higher in saturated fat and sugar. And so again, that's why the dietitian is of utmost importance, to make sure that you have a good balance of everything and that you don't go from being underweight, unfortunately, to then being significantly overweight, because those foods that you're eating do have more calories than the gluten-containing counterparts. So yes, short question, very, very long answer. All our patients, you know, if the gut's healthy and healed, they should get to an appropriate weight for them. And again, so long as the growth plates aren't closed, they should get to what their expected height should be.
Great, great. And do you partner, since I work in endocrinology and in diabetes, how do you partner with our endocrinology team? So for instance, if you saw a patient who is newly diagnosed with celiac, maybe you need some more information on growth, who are your go-to docs in our program, or how do you partner? Yeah,
so we have a number of pediatric endocrinologists. I could start throwing out their names, but there's a lot of them. So what I would typically recommend is similar to us, you know, sometimes families want to be seen at satellite clinics. So I'll normally just have them call the main scheduling number and then ask for an endocrinologist, and again, a pediatric in the case of my patients. And if they have certain specifications about where they want to be seen, then our scheduling department can help guide them as to who might be the best person for them.
That's fantastic. And I can also attest to the fact that because I've been in endocrinology so long, folks can email me directly. I am more than happy to help guide them We also have a fantastic program I want to plug for 2 seconds. Dr. Verma will be proud of me. We are really excited to bring you a type 1 diabetes and celiac kind of dual clinic that we've created with Dr. Katie O'Sullivan, who sees patients with type 1 diabetes. But as you know, Dr. Jericho, there's many patients with celiac disease that maybe have other growth questions and growth hormone issues, and that's also endocrinology. So happy to see those patients dually or separately at satellite clinics. We're out at Orland. Dr. Jericho, where do you see patients?
So I specifically see patients at Comer Children's Hospital in Hyde Park, and then I'm also out in Indiana, in Maryville, Indiana. So
wonderful,
a lot of patients out there in that area.
That's great. We have a lot of satellite opportunities. Dr. Verma, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, thank you for plugging the type 1 diabetes and celiac clinic. Macy is part of that clinic, and it's a virtual clinic, so we pretty much can see anyone from anywhere. And it's not just limited to type 1 diabetes, it's actually limited to anything endocrine. And Dr. Sullivan is also a med peds person, so she does both pediatrics and adults. But it's a nice telehealth clinic where you can see all 3 of us together. So Dr. Sullivan, myself, and Macy, we come on together in a meeting just like this.
That's great. And certainly folks can, again, reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, or maybe I'll ask Karen to do that for me now. And then also if she could place Mark Jankosik's email in the chat as well. So Mark is our trusted partner and friend who helps make appointments. And he knows us very well in pediatric and adult GI and in endocrinology, so he can help navigate this process. Priyanka, question for you. Lots of questions, both on and offline, about navigating celiac disease as a young adult and sort of outing yourself in a professional setting, right? So COVID has changed things significantly, but it used to be that every meeting we went into, there was coffee and creamer and donuts, and, you know, even in a job interview, they're like, you know, do you want some hot chocolate? And so how do you navigate that with people that don't know you, and you also want to like set the tone for who you are as a person and not really have celiac define you?
It's awkward. It's not easy. I think, you know, I just had this experience, like I was saying, applying to residency. Every single interview I went to was a buffet of sandwiches and bagels and all this stuff. And initially, you know, I interviewed at, I don't know, 20 plus places. And in the beginning, I started by emailing and saying, you know, I have dietary restrictions. Is there anything I'm going to be able to eat? And then after a while, that got really cumbersome because pretty much every single place was like, no, sorry. And I know that that's not consistent across subspecialties. That might be a surgery problem, but I think the, you know, you have to just own it. I think at a certain point, I kind of try to just say like, oh, you know, I have celiac disease, or I'm gluten-free. I can't have that. Thanks. Do you have a water, you know, or something, just like something of that sort. I always carry a snack bar in my bag 100% of the time, because you never want to be hangry, like Lori was talking about earlier. It makes things awful. So, you know, just kind of trying to manage those situations, try not to make it a big deal. Is sort of how I've handled it. I think everyone kind of has their own style about it, but I just try to say one sentence, eat my own snack, and move on.
Sure, I so appreciate that. So we answered that one live. Thank you so much. So, you know, lots of really important questions too about products, gluten-free products. Macy, maybe you can take this one for us. I think that many of us shop at the typical grocery stores in the Chicagoland area, but not all on this call or on this Zoom today are from the Chicagoland area. So, you know, what if you go to like a mom and pop grocery store that's fairly small and they don't have gluten-free products? Like, would you recommend talking to the manager? Would you recommend ordering things online? You know, what can we do to sort of help smaller grocery stores develop more options?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I get it that there might be like some products you really want that are gluten-free that they don't have. But if you actually find a grocery store that contains nothing that is gluten-free, let me know, because I would be a little shocked. I'm sure they have some like fruit or vegetable or like seed or, you know, bar or rice or something. But as for like actual products, if you're a regular shopper there, a lot of managers are more than happy to discuss like what their regular customers need or want. And so definitely bringing it up to the manager, seeing if that's something that can be ordered in, possibly. They might have more access to even more options than you might find, but also ordering online, especially, it seems counterintuitive, but like in rural areas or smaller areas, it actually is one of the best ways to get some of those staples. It might be a little bit expensive because you might be buying more at once, especially to get like free shipping, right? Like $50 worth of your favorite bread products or gluten-free bagel products or something. But then you can keep those in the freezer and then still shop at your mom and pop store for those other staples. We do talk about that in clinic pretty often, but yeah, that is what I recommend.
Thank you so much, Macy. We're a little bit all over the board here, but I do want to make sure we include some great questions. So Dr. Leone, this one could be for you. This is an interesting philosophical question about how we grow sort of the research path and circle. What is being done now to grow the ecosystem of researchers and research ideas? So, you know, really, how do we grow that circle of researchers focusing on celiac disease? Mute. Oh, so sorry. Mute. Unmute, I should say. Unmute.
Sorry about that. It's a good question and a complex question. I am going to sound very biased, but I will try to explain my opinion. The best way to expand research in a given disease is to have drugs approved on the market. That just has been proven again and again for all other diseases. For example, think that patients with Crohn's disease, for example, years ago needed to take immune suppressants, almost like medications to prevent transplant rejection, very toxic drugs. And now you can have a single subcutaneous injection every 2 to 3 months with a biologic agent, and that keeps your disease under control. So what happened to go from the toxic medications to the every quarter biologic injection? 20, 30 years of research, progressive improvements with medications on the market that drove greater interest by industry, by investors, by academia. It is an ecosystem, and unfortunately, as most things in the world, money plays a big role. If there is no profit, there is no investment. If there's no investment, there are no grants. It's a sad reality, and I hate to speak about this, but we do need to be able to show some success out of our clinical studies. And please bear in mind that I am not a proponent of medicines for everybody. One of the research activities I carry out, and I started a company for it as well, is to try to help patients avoid gluten with the gluten tests, the stool, urine tests. So if half of the patients with celiac disease manage to avoid gluten just because they're good with the diet, that's terrific. If we can then help another 30% of patients to avoid gluten with diagnostics and education, that would be great. But at the end of the day, there are going to be perhaps 10, 20% of patients who will, despite their best efforts, continue to be exposed. And for those, we believe we need to provide options that include vaccines, medicines. But to get to those options, we need to work together to provide these solutions. Let me just say that the last example, and I apologize, but just to illustrate this, cystic fibrosis. It's a very devastating disease where children die, congenital genetic disorder. So the patient support groups realized in order to bring investment, they need some drugs on the market to help their constituents, but also to bring investment. So they raised money, they helped a company called Vertex conduct clinical trials in exchange for a large equity position. So Vertex took an equity position or the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation took an equity position on Vertex. Thanks to the money provided by Vertex, the trials worked. And the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation made $3 billion profit, which they then reinvested in new medications. So today, 95% of patients with cystic fibrosis no longer die because of those medications. And it's just an example of this ecosystem and the number of grants that they have supported, academic grants, education, with that money is phenomenal. So in celiac, we're just a few years behind. Diabetes, which I know is close to your heart, Peggy, and we have, diabetes is showing us the way. JDRF and other organizations sponsoring research. Provention Bio, my company, was founded thanks to a small investment from JDRF. Without JDRF, there wouldn't be Provention. They put the seed to start the company. It's another example of how patients donating money, contributing to research, get science going at the industry level and at the academic level as well. They donate money, JDRF, to a lot of academic enterprises. So we just have to all work together on this.
I appreciate that. Dr. Verma, I may have you address that in a few minutes, but I have some really fantastic questions. So vitamin D, how do we think about vitamin D if it's still chronically low in a diagnosed child, for instance, with celiac disease? Is it because of celiac disease? Is it because of something else? What are the best supplements for vitamin D? Lots of questions about that. So you want to talk more about vitamin D? It seems to be the hottest thing right now with COVID, with the bad weather we have in Chicago and no sun. Lots of questions about vitamin D, but specifically in celiac, especially if you have a child with low vitamin D, chronically, that's a problem.
So I think everyone has a low vitamin D. The other day, Macy and I saw someone who had 50, a really good level, and we were both so shocked. So it's not unusual to see children and adults with vitamin D deficiency. And I think if it's from celiac disease, if it's just celiac disease, of course, as you start absorption and so long as Macy and Lori can weigh in on from a diet standpoint, so that's important. But often people living in this part of the world or where the sun is not out, or even if the sun is out and you're really lathering a lot of sunscreen, you're not absorbing as much. So there is a need to have vitamin D supplementation. And then the dose that you supplement is different based on the level, based on, some people will dose once a week because that's the most convenient. Sometimes you can dose every day. So it all depends, and then checking the level. And I usually like to check a level once I start somebody on it, and I'll check a level in a few months. And then in order to know what they should do for the whole year, I will check a level before summer and then somewhere in the December, so that you kind of know what to do and guide people through that. If you're getting enough vitamin D and the dietitians have discussed and they're taking the supplements and the celiac is under control and the vitamin D levels are not going up, then it's important to look at other things. And then you start looking at, what are the other reasons why you may not be absorbing vitamin D? Can that be renal? Can that be looking at parathyroid? Can that be looking at inflammatory bowel disease? Then you look at other reasons. But I know that from my patients, Macy plays a major role in having a discussion about the vitamin D and so on. And I'm sure Lori does that with the adults as well. So maybe Macy and Lori, you could comment on the vitamin D from your standpoint.
Yeah, just kind of piggybacking on what Dr. Verma is saying. So really just that general diet review, just to see if any, vitamin D fortified food or beverage is consumed. Also kind of plays into how much vitamin D we may recommend depending on the lab level, but also, also the age of the child, since we work with all children. And really specifically, I don't usually have any specific recommendations for the vitamin D supplement, except unless the child needs something, liquid versus capsule versus something like that, as well as how much they're taking in a multivitamin. If they're taking, we take that into account. But then we always just recommend in the form of D3 is what we just make sure the patient is taking. I don't know if you have anything else to add, Lori.
Yeah, I don't really have that. You've covered a lot of things I was going to say. So just kind of assessing the diet, and everyone's different, and supplement is needed, and then really getting the levels checked. That's what we definitely recommend.
And how about calcium? Is that something that you bring along with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I always explain that you will never be able to absorb your calcium if your vitamin D is in the gutter. So we really, and then yes, making sure they're getting some sort of calcium in the diet or supplementing if needed.
And the only other thing I was going to add in, and we almost never see this, but too much of anything is sometimes not a good thing either. So just making sure to follow, the age appropriate dosing. I did have a patient, potentially the first one ever, who was getting lots of different sources of vitamin D, a multivitamin by itself, who came to me recently with GI symptoms that it seems are probably because this child's level is so high. So just always being mindful of that as well, that yes, we need it, but too much of a good thing suddenly can become not a good thing anymore. So just following labeling and making sure not to go too much over the top.
I really appreciate you sharing that. I agree, especially since vitamin D is something that people are talking quite a bit about in relation to COVID. This question could be for Vanessa or for Priyanka. I value your perspective about what's out there for, and anyone on this panel, what's out there specifically for men and celiac disease. I've had some really great questions today about support groups that exist, that men sometimes want to be with other men and talk about things that are valuable to them. What is the effect of celiac disease on male fertility? What are some of the issues that young men want to address versus women? And my quick search as I'm sitting here is not great. Right? Not great answers. What can we do to maybe help young guys and men in general think about how celiac disease affects them? Anybody? Vanessa, you want to start?
Sure. So I think there are a couple of things, and I echo the concerns. This is a huge problem across the board. Yeah. But we've done a few things to try and improve this on the patient level and on the parent level. So on the patient level, I think it's really helpful if the providers have a follow-up patient who they see as a really good advocate for themselves, to encourage them to become a mentor and to, connect them to newly diagnosed younger boys, so that perhaps we start building this network of mentors where there's boys that can work with each other. Mm-hmm. We found this really helpful in Boston, especially for young athletes who want to, talk about how they can, grow strong and how they can participate in team things. So I would challenge the providers to start trying to make these connections. Also, bring your husbands to support group meetings. In the beginning, my husband was very leery of going to these meetings. He's like, but you handle it. But, as he's gone, he's met so many other dads that he's bonded with and have become his own support community with. So even though they may not like it at first, encourage them to come along and just to meet others, and they will naturally find it. Even my own father, who does, he has a wife with celiac disease and a daughter and a grandson with celiac disease. And he was not the most supportive one back in the 1990s when my mom was diagnosed. But today he's the first one to talk to other grandparents about what it's like to have a grandson with celiac disease and how they can be supportive too. So just start encouraging them to come.
I think that's fantastic. And I think all of us, including those of us at the University of Chicago Celiac Center, need to think about it. Think about ways that we can support boys and young men and all men think about celiac. And to your point, not just about those who think about not just those who have celiac disease themselves, but those who are caregivers, right? That moms don't have to show up to the meetings alone. So 2 more questions. We've got a few minutes here, if you don't mind. We've got about 4 more minutes. So many good questions. Dr. Verma, maybe you could take this one. But then also Priyanka, I want you to jump in. Chronic migraines and celiac disease. Migraines are a biggie. Migraines are a struggle for many of us who do not have celiac disease, and those who do, it can be a real challenge. Thoughts on MRI and CT scans for those with migraines? Thoughts on referrals to a neurologist? Do we partner with a neurologist at the Celiac Center at U of C? How do we do that? How do we address that?
So maybe Priyanka can take her experience first, and then I can talk about patients.
Sure. So in retrospect, I think maybe my only symptom, even though I say I'm asymptomatic, was actually migraines. I had pretty terrible migraines as in a middle school kid and a high school kid, which was just very strange. And they were very strange migraines too. They weren't like, normal, like I was losing my vision and things like that. So I saw a neurologist. I think you have to do your due diligence and do all the appropriate workup, but actually since going gluten-free, they have pretty much gone away, I think. And then now, even if I do have some accidental ingestion, I think the only things I notice are a headache or brain fog type of thing, like something more neurologic. So I think that it could be part of it. And just one quick thing also on the last question while I am here, is about the boys.
Yeah.
I think the big thing that I think has probably helped my brother was going to camp. So I did mention Camp Celiac, but there's a lot of guys there. They're just doing guy things. And then also all happen to have celiac. And then my dad went and my mom also went as counselors. So I think, there are a lot of adult male role models who go to the camp as well, who are, counselors and things that you can kind of connect with there. But back to the migraines, yes, they did get better after.
Awesome. I love that. I'm putting this in the chat right now. Okay, great. Lots of questions which we didn't get to today about females of childbearing age interested in being pregnant. One attendee today has asked some really good questions that she wasn't diagnosed until age 30 with celiac disease and worries a lot about her fertility. She's worried about gluten exposure now, damage that's perhaps already been done. It's hard because Dr. Verma and Dr. Jericho, you partner with a lot of pediatric docs, but we certainly could partner at the University of Chicago and have, I know, with reproductive endocrinology, with our colleagues in maternal fetal medicine. But do you have any perspective on this, or do you want to talk a little bit about fertility? Vanessa, please jump in too if there's something happening at Boston Children's in this space.
I think Lori maybe works a lot with the adult GI folks. Lori and Vanessa might be good at helping with some of this. I mean, from our perspective, but from our perspective in pediatrics, we don't want to talk fertility.
And
Lori, go ahead, Lori.
Even speaking from my own perspective, again, I was diagnosed at 35 and after 2 miscarriages and literally was like, am I going to have to go through IVF? And so me personally, I was literally gluten-free for 12 months and boom, I got pregnant. And I was like, oh my gosh. So again, like anyone, I think I've had so many patients get pregnant since they went gluten-free, again, that have celiac, of course. And I know, and many are very concerned because you're like, oh my gosh, if I get gluten, am I going to have a miscarriage? I mean, I went through it myself, like literally both pregnancies. But I think the main thing is just making sure that your serologies go down, that you're starting to feel better. I wouldn't say trying to get pregnant right after you go gluten-free. I really think that making sure that you get yourself well nourished and whatnot. So again, giving yourself a little time. In 30, you're still very young. Again, I just turned 40 and had my second kid. So I'm a little bit older for mom, but again, it's still, I think the main thing is, again, just going gluten-free can really just help fertility. Alone. So there's nothing that's what we usually say, just try to go gluten-free for a good chunk of time, at least a half a year to a year.
I appreciate that. And certainly you can see us at the University of Chicago and talk to Lori a little bit more about statistics out there, information. Vanessa, you want to talk a little bit about pregnancy and female fertility and celiac?
So I also work with a mostly pediatric population, but I will say from my own experience that I was diagnosed with celiac disease in college when I was 20. And I was gluten-free for a little over 10 years and had 2 healthy, beautiful baby boys. I did have a miscarriage as well. Don't know if that was related. I hope not, is that I was on a strict gluten-free diet. But, I know lots of people with celiac disease who have had very successful pregnancies.
I appreciate that. I think we had just one more question, and I think we'll wrap with this. People are looking for a diagnostic test for celiac disease if they stay gluten-free. So, a lot of people don't want to go off a gluten diet. And and then get tested, right? So I struggle with this with my daughter with allergies, right? So before a food challenge, she's got to go off all of her antihistamines, and it's like a nightmare, right? For 6 to 7 days before we're like, holy cow, like, can we handle this? And it's like a challenge to get to the food challenge. So any diagnostic tests out there or hope regarding diagnosing celiac disease properly if you're still gluten-free?
Francisco, do you want to, Francisco, you may want to talk something from the vaccine trial. Is that something you would want to comment on?
Yes, so in terms of diagnostics that do not require gluten challenge for people who are already on a gluten-free diet, the tests have been developed in Europe, a test called the tetramer test, and it's now coming to the US. Initially, it's been tested primarily in Boston in academic studies. Another test, interleukin-2 test as well, developed by ImmuSanti back in the day. But again, the challenge that we have right now is that the folks developing those assays are looking for investment to develop them commercially, and that has not happened yet. So it remains something that is technically feasible, but is not offered, and it will take a few years. But I think the message is it's coming.
And I just wanted to comment as well. Is it echoing for you, or is that just, is it still, it's not echoing anymore. Okay. You know, the one test that we can fall back on that is never going to change, whether you're on the diet or not, are the genetics. What I think all of us always try to explain to the families, though, is the genetics really are only helpful if they're negative. If you don't have either of those genes that were mentioned previously, the DQ2, the DQ8, the likelihood that you actually have missed celiac is very, very low. So if you get the genetics, and you can do that on or off of a gluten-free diet, and they are absolutely negative, again, the likelihood that you actually have celiac disease is exceptionally low. If they're positive, you know, about, depending on what you look at, 30 to 40% of the population have the genetics and never develop celiac. So they don't help if they're positive, but that is one of those things that we can do if people have questions and don't want to go back on gluten, is we can get the genes, and if they're negative, again, it helps to suggest very strongly that that person does not have underlying celiac. So that, you know, that's kind of our one fallback. Unfortunately, all the other things do depend on gluten exposure to turn them positive, the blood testing, the scopes, things like that. So it is tricky without being on a gluten-containing diet.
I appreciate that. Well, it is 1:04. We did a lot today. I want to thank Dr. Jericho, Dr. Verma, Vanessa, Lori, Macy, Dr. Leone, Priyanka. Just what a fantastic group. Karen, bravo for your help. You're always such a great partner. She's not showing her face right now, but maybe I can make her. So Karen, thank you, thank you. Cheers, virtual cheers. Lisa and Taryn and the team at Meeting Achievements, thank you so much. We are excited to bring you some more programs and Facebook Live events with our family network, and you'll see invitations and information about those coming up between St. Patrick's Day and Easter. You'll see some things this spring. We also have a fantastic continuing medical education conference coming up virtually on April 17th. So you'll certainly receive information about that. Priyanka, we're going to have you back for sure. Vanessa, for sure. Thank you for joining us from the East Coast. And we'll see everyone soon. And hope you had a wonderful day and learned a lot. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.